بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته everyone. This is Haroon. Welcome to our third lesson with Shah Waliullah's Hujjatullah al-Baligha. In this video I want to just briefly introduce the first volume, or to provide you with an overview of the first volume of his book. The reason I'm doing all of this is that we get an overview of the text before we actually dive into it. So the first volume is really about this here. أسباب التكليف والمجازات. And it begins with this, Shah Walillah begins with this, which is the asbab, which means the cause of taklif. So why do we have responsibility? Why has God, Allah, decreed for us or ordered us to follow his commands? And the majazat, what rewards will we get? So there's a relationship between obligations, taklif, okay, or being mukallaf, and receiving recompense for that. Of course, if you follow the right obligation, you get the right recompense. If you don't follow obligations commanded by God, then your recompense will be something else. So Shah Waliullah Dehlavi really wants to bring this in. This is the foundational discourse with which Shah Waliullah Dehlavi begins his text. Okay, and what he does at the beginning is that he deals with the metaphysical aspects of causation, beginning with creation. So he'll talk about a number of things. Ibda. Ibda means basically origination. It means origination. Okay, and only God can do that. And it was to bring something from nothingness. And he'll talk about this in the first volume as well. So I'm just going to write that again. Origination. He'll talk about creation, which is this word khalq, and tadbir, how Allah manages everything. Okay, and this is also taken from the Quran. So all of these ideas are obviously taken from the Quran as well. So he begins with a process of creation, and he talks about various ways God's will, Allah's will, is enacted. Allah's will is implemented in our world, but also in the world that's beyond us. Okay, so I've used the word physical and the supra-physical as found in the translation of Hujjatullah as well. So he'll talk about that as well. Now, an important part of Shah Wali's discussion here as well is his psychological and moral framework. And here he begins to talk about this idea that the human being is composed of two components. There's an angelic component and there's an animalistic component. And the reason I put the angelic component on top is that human beings should focus on developing that and going for upwards. Of course, if they don't and they follow their desires, for example, then they follow their animalistic trait, which actually brings them down. So this is all to do with this discussion that he has, almost called Haqiqatul Ruh, and these sort of discussions that Shah Waliullah will bring to our attention. And so we have this intrinsic component within us, and the idea is for us to focus on our moral and spiritual development. Now, Shah Waliullah doesn't go into detail, but elsewhere in his books, he'll talk about Sufi practices. In this text, he doesn't actually go in too much detail about certain Sufi practices that we do, but you'll find this in other books as well. But the idea is that he wants us to focus on developing our angelic self, to rise above and to really become better human beings, and to make sure that we don't become animalistic. This is what society generally falls into, right? They follow their desires, their hawa, their shahwa, and so therefore they are dragged down. So he'll talk about that in some detail as well. The second section of the first volume talks about what's called Kayfiyatul Majazat fil Hayat wa Ba'd al Mamat. And this is to do with how we are awarded or rewarded for our actions in this world after we leave this world. Right? So Shah Waliullah will also talk about that in his first volume. What he also talks about is another few more things as well, which I'm going to bring to your attention, which is here. Okay, and this is really, really interesting. especially those of you who are interested in economics like me, because I have a degree in economics, is this idea of irtifaqat. There's a lot of discussion around what this word actually means. And it comes from this idea of gentleness. But here we're talking about civilizational development. And Shah Walillah talks about how it goes through 4 stages. Before I talk about the 4 stages, it's very, very useful, this whole discussion, number 3 here, because if you're into economics, whether you're into sociology, whether into civilizational studies, political theory, natural law, Shah Waliullah will be of interest for you here as well. And if you're reading him with Ibn Khaldun, who some of us will know about, he has some theories as well on civilization. So it'd be very, very useful to read that. We will hopefully, inshallah, cover that as well. As for the 4 stages that Shah Waliullah talks about, the 4 stages are here. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm just going to mention them for you. The first one is this idea of following a natural instinctive law. We'll get into some discussion around this idea that we have this idea of natural law, right? There's things that are instinctive about us. The second thing is integrating the family and social transactions. The third thing is about your local political ordering, and the fourth thing is international concern. And in the end, Shah Waliullah talks about this idea of establishing the caliphate. Very, very important. I will go through that. Very topical. A lot of people talk about the caliphate, what it means. There's a lot's been written on this. Much ink has been spilt on this, and it's an important concept in our deen, in our religion. So Shah Waliullah also has something to talk about here. He has other books where he talks about this as well, but he does develop an interesting theory for us there. And then he talks about number 4, this idea of sa'ada. Sa'ada, we call it human felicity or felicity, again taken from the Sharia. And how do we acquire happiness? Okay, how do we become? How do we get felicity? Right, and he talks about 4 virtues, very, very important, and we'll go through them. Absolutely essential for us to know them. What's called tahara, purity. What's called ikhbat, humility. What's called samaha, magnanimity, big word, and adala, and justice. Right, these things we need to focus on. But he also talks about barriers that prevent us from acquiring these 3 barriers that Shah Waliullah will also talk about. And these are customs and conventions he'll talk about. So sometimes things creep into our religion, and sometimes they can distract us. A common one, misunderstanding God. Right? If you don't understand God, or you have the wrong conceptualization of God, you're going to have problems. Okay? But he also, as he is a genius, he'll tell you how to treat them. Like a doctor, he'll tell you how to treat yourself as well. So that will come up in the 4th section of the book. The last 2 sections, number 5, is he'll talk about bir and ism, which is piety and sin. And this very much is similar to Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the religious sciences. If you've read the Ihya Ulumuddin, maybe one day I'll teach that as well. I've had the honor of teaching that and studying that as well. And so he talks about piety and performing religious obligations. Why should we pray? Why should we do good actions, right? And the right attitude that we should have as well. But he also talks about what's really, really important for a lot of us today is the inner meanings, the secrets, the sir, right? What are the inner meanings of the Sharia? And finally, in the section 6 here, he talks about some other sundry topics, as I call them, which are to do with prophecy, development of religion, so how religions develop historically, how do religions come about, specific rulings that specific religions have that might not apply to us, or we have that didn't apply to other religions. And he talks about something very, very important here, which is Islam and other religions. I've written rulings, which should be religions. Islam and other religions. And what is our relationship with other faiths? I'm not really focusing on interfaith, but more to do with understanding other religious traditions. Right? So I hope that's been useful as an introduction to Shah Waliullah's first volume. I will continue with more in the next video. Please do leave your feedback and comments. I've received some very positive comments over the last week. I'm really honored that you've responded and you've given me encouragement. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.